The Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College presents 10 years of best-selling authors and great thinkers. Each week we broadcast new videos from our 10-year speaker archive online for free at our website. We look forward to seeing you again when it's safe. Please enjoy this presentation from the archives of the Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Louis Frumkes, director of the Hunter College Writing Center, and I welcome you this evening to our Elizabeth Strong Cuevas lecture, one of the more important events on our calendar. For her part, Elizabeth Strong Cuevas is not only one of our most generous benefactors, she is also one of America's greatest sculptors. Her work is found in many museums and exhibited all over the world. Elizabeth couldn't be here this evening because a major exhibit of her work is opening in Boston, I believe. Suffice that this past summer, one of her exquisite, larger bronze pieces was on display from June to September in Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza on East 49th Street, across from the UN. In any event, our speaker, who is giving the de Cuevas lecture tonight, is also our 2014-15 Gerda Vanderbilt Whitney Connor Writer-in-Residence, Edward Hirsch. It is easy to tell you about Edward Hirsch. He is simply the most brilliant poet / advocate of poetry walking the earth. You could walk into a room where Edward is speaking, and where I am turning pages, terribly with this sort of thing, ignorant of what poetry is or caring a whit about it, and walk out enlightened, illuminated, and a sudden convert to the beautiful music that poets create, a new fan and devotee of that rarefied literary art. Nor is Edward without credentials. He has received numerous awards and fellowships, including a MacArthur Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, an Ingram Merrill Foundation Award, a Pablo Neruda Presidential Medal of Honor, the Prix de Rome, and an Academy of Arts and Letters Award. In 2008, he was elected Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets, and at present serves as president of the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. In addition to his many books and volumes of poetry, among them Earthly Measures, which Harold Bloom included in the Western canon, he is the editor of Theodore Retke's Selected Poems, co-editor of The Making of a Sonnet, a Norton anthology, and editor of the series The Writer's World. The New York Times Book Review just raved about his new book-length elegy, Gabriel, in which Edward confronts the loss of his son. It is widely regarded as a masterpiece of sorrow. It gives me great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to present the Hunter College Writing Center's Gerda Vanderbilt Whitney Writer-in-Residence for 2015, Edward Hirsch.
Hi, everybody. Nice night. Thanks for coming. You get extra points for coming out in this weather. I was going to talk to you about the subject of poetry and walking, if you're game for that. But if you don't like that topic, I can change and talk about other things. Does that seem interesting enough to you to start? And then I'll talk for a while about that, and then I'll open it up. And if there's anything else you want to talk about related to poetry, I'm game. I know very little about life, but I know a lot about poetry. Glad to talk about it. I thought I'd start with a poem that I wrote that gave me the idea for talking to you about poetry and walking. It's called Cotton Candy. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? Yes? Can you hear me okay? We walked on the bridge over the Chicago River for what turned out to be the last time, and I ate cotton candy that sugary air, that sweet blue light spun out of nothingness. It was just a moment, really, nothing more. But I remember marveling at the sturdy cables of the bridge that held us up, and threading my fingers through the long and slender fingers of my grandfather, an old man from the old world who long ago disappeared into the nether regions. And I remember that 8-year-old boy who had tasted the sweetness of air, which still clings to my mouth and disappears when I breathe. So that poem is a walk. It's the God, whenever I read that poem, sirens come like that, and they just, I guess they have a special feeling about it in the city. The poem is a walk. It's about the last walk I took with my grandfather before he died. I was 8 years old, and it's a poem that tries to be about bridging, because we're walking over the Chicago River, and the fragility and the connection between the cotton candy, which I'm eating, which is vaporous air, and the bridge, which is so solid. And there's a kind of interlocking of our hands as we walk. And so the poem is really about bridging, going from one place to another, of a boy and his grandfather. And so it occurred to me that some of my poems are walks. And there's an essay by the poet A.R. Ammons called "A Poem is a Walk." And I began to think about this topic, which I think is a topic hiding in plain sight. I think that poetry is a vocation, and as long as I've had that feeling about poetry as my vocation, I've associated with walking. And walking, I'm thinking of in two ways. First of all, I'm thinking of it as the kind of place for the drift as you walk and daydream, where you're in and out of your body. You're betwixt and between. I'm not talking about utilitarian walking. I'm walking to get from here. I'm giving a lecture at Hunter tonight. I walked from my office. I got to get there, not going to be late. Get out of my way, umbrellas. I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking about a walk when you take a walk for its own sake, a kind of meander, and how that leads to a kind of reverie, because you're neither here nor there. And you're in your body, but you're also out of your body for the able body. Now, I have to distinguish that, because for people who are disabled, walking suddenly becomes a challenge. For people who have strokes, suddenly walking becomes a challenge. And what you've done naturally since you're a child no longer seems natural to you. But for those of us who are not disabled, walking is something you can forget about while you're doing it. So you're in your body, but you're also dreaming somewhere else. And as I began to think about this topic of a way of the walk as a way of entering the body and also of leaving it, a way of loosening the mind for reverie, I began to think also about other poems about walking and the history of walking in poetry. Walking is a kind of form of how it's represented in poetry. Because although walking seems completely natural, it also has a kind of history, which begins with bipedalism. We stand up and walk. So that's my topic. The intermingling of the history of walking, the way that walking instigates a certain kind of reverie, which loosens the mind for a certain kind of thinking. And I'm going to distinguish here poetic thinking from philosophical thinking. Something alogical, something driftier, some form of association, not completely unstructured, but a way of thinking, of access to the mind that's not entirely logical or rational, which is alogical, which I'm calling poetic thinking, and then the history of that representation in poetry. So that's our subject. So there's a terrific essay by Thoreau on walking, and I put on my glass because I want to read the quote to you, where in his essay on walking he says, "You must walk like a camel, which is said to be the only beast which ruminates when walking." So he thought of walking as a sort of crusade. And when you read a lot about walking and people who walk, you suddenly find this sort of ideological component to walking, which is odd. But for him, it has a kind of religious aura because it's about going into the wilderness. It's about going into the wild. It's about leaving civilization or the familiar. And he thinks this leads you to some other special, more sacred place. And he says the word sauntering, this is inaccurate, by the way, in terms of its accuracy from the history of etymology, but it's interesting for Thoreau because he thought it was true. The word sauntering derived from idle people who roved about the country in the Middle Ages and asked charity under pretense of going à la Saint-Terre to the Holy Land. But in fact, the word saunter does come from saunter, meaning to muse, to be in a reverie, which is how I'm taking it, a way of ruminating, of musing, a form of labor without laboring, of what Kant calls purposiveness without purpose. And so I think that adventure parallels reading and writing, because you're sauntering off into the unknown. One moment you're walking along and you're in familiar territory. The next moment you're staring into an abyss. I'm an urban kid, and so for me, I'm going to distinguish between walking in the country and walking in the city. I like to walk in cities, but in fact, when you read the literature later, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the difference in American poetry, how one walk leads from Thoreau into the wild, and another walk leads from Whitman into the city. But in fact, whether you're walking in the country or the city, in terms of the quality of reverie or meditation, that doesn't matter. I mean, it matters to the environmentalists, it matters to the country poets, and it matters to the urban poets. But in terms of what happens in your mind, in terms of the triggers of reverie that I'm talking about, it's the same. But for me, because I'm an urban walker primarily, I was especially interested to discover when I was young, when I first went abroad, when I was in my early 20s, Charles Baudelaire's notion of the flaneur. Is this something you know about? Do you know about the flaneur? Baudelaire had the idea of the walker in the city. He got the idea partially from reading Poe's The Man in the Crowd. So the flaneur is a person who's walking in the city, but unlike the mercantile people, he's not going to get anywhere. He's lounging around. He's mixing with the crowd. He's walking in a kind of space for reverie. And he calls this the flaneur. He calls the flaneur a passionate spectator, which gives him license to abandon himself to the crowd and to treat the street as a dwelling, to be away from home and yet to feel oneself everywhere at home, to see the world, to be at the center of the world, and yet to remain hidden from the world. The flaneur, here's Walter Benjamin explaining it, is as much at home among the facades of houses as a citizen is in his four walls. The walls are the desk against which he presses his notebooks. Newsstands are his libraries, and the terraces of cafes are the balconies from which he looks down on his household after his work is done. So this is what Baudelaire calls the pedestrian of Paris, the one who saunters, the one who muses. But the reason this is a radical notion, because it challenges a kind of capitalist idea of always working, of always getting somewhere, of making every moment count in a utilitarian way. For Baudelaire, he's the one, the flaneur, who's mixing with the crowd, but only dreaming, only meditating, not actually getting anywhere, not actually doing anything purposeful. So for him, it's a kind of anti-capitalist gesture, because everyone in the city is buying and selling, but he's not buying and selling. So that's interesting to me as a poet, because it tells you something about poetry, which is a non-utilitarian art. That is, the greatness of poetry is its impracticality. It has another kind of knowledge, another kind of wisdom. Just parenthetically, there's never been a culture without poetry. So poetry is giving us some kind of knowledge, but it's not practical knowledge. It's not useful information in the same way that the news is useful information or the stock prices are useful information, but it's giving us something else. And the fact of that there's never been a culture without it, suggests that it must be something crucial. It's hard to get the news from poems, so there wouldn't be poems if you could get the news elsewhere. But poetry is giving you something else, non-utilitarian. And that, in this talk about poetry and walking, that's what I'm trying to get at. What does it give you? What kind of interiority does it open up inside of you? And the walk I'm using is a kind of metaphor for a kind of process that takes you inside yourself and also takes you outside yourself. Because the walk, you're in your daydreaming space, but you're also in the external world. You're not alone in your study, for example, which is one way to write poetry. But I'm now talking about walking outside, being amongst others, and yet separate from others. I don't know if you've heard of the Romanian psychologist Milali Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote a book called Flow. And he speaks of flow as a complex flow activity, almost an art form, which is related to walking. It's a non-volitional act that can be turned into utilitarian exercise, power walking, or stylized into collective art like marching bands. But for Csikszentmihalyi, it's a way of entering into the creative process to get the juices moving or flowing or rolling. So I want to say that walking, which seems entirely natural, is not entirely natural. It's also cultural. If you walk in a parade from a different country, you soon learn that you walk differently than the other people in the parade. I learned this the hard way in a West Indian parade, where I clearly stood out and up. So walking has its own vernacular or language. I studied folklore at the University of Pennsylvania, and that's where I started to come on all these terms, or at least become alert to them. So I've written some of them down. We speak of walking on water, walking on air, walking on eggshells, and walking the plank, which is what I'm doing now. We tell someone to step on it or take a hike. We let others know we're hoofing it. We say something is a cakewalk. The term cakewalk comes from a traditional African American dance, an amended two-step, which originated among Southern slaves. It was also called the walkabout or the strut, the chalk line walk. We recognize the lingo of popular song, I Walk the Line, walking to New Orleans. These boots were made for walking. The British have a term called Shank's pony and invented a form of competitive speed walking known as heel and toe. They gambled on it like horse racing. We make poetic meters with feet. We marvel at sleepwalkers who literalize unconscious wandering. We collect folk stories about night walkers who dwell in the fearsome shadows. Walking is older than the oldest profession, which we call street walking, as new as the latest walkathon. When we walk in the street, we notice people, we mark them, we recognize them by age, by gender, by race, by region, by class. We read people with remarkable fluency. We interpret them, sometimes misinterpret them at a glance. Walking is part of the history of migration, of travel, of ethnography, of tourism, and of work. It's also part of the history of poetry. Whole schools of poets were connected to walking. The Italian Podesta troubadours, the Gaelic hedge school poets. There were itinerant scholars such as the Goliards who flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries. There are itinerant professions like street musicians in Romania or corpse walkers in rural China who walk the dead home to their native provinces. The nomadic way of life has always been grounded in walking. There are forced walks in which walking is a sign of displacement, as it is for refugees who trudge under heavy burdens. Walking is the most fundamental mode of transportation, of ordinary act with a long human history. Whether you commence that history some 6 million years ago with the origins of bipedalism, Plato called man a featherless biped, or religion. And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. So walking has its own evolutionary history, but the history of walking as a conscious act is actually quite recent. That is, romantic tourism generally dates to the late 18th, early 19th century. That is, as an activity rather than as a means to an end, which is what I'm talking about. So it generally dates to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who confessed, "I can only meditate when I am walking. When I stop, I cease to think. My mind only works with my legs." So Rousseau treated walking as a stimulus for reverie. Is this interesting to you? Are you with me okay? It's not too academic for you? Tell me if it is, okay? I can get going in the corners here. I know that about myself. So you're with me? Yeah, okay. I'll notice if you all walk out on my talk on walking. So Rousseau treated walking as a stimulus for reverie, and he wrote, there are a lot of walks, a lot about walking in the Confessions, the Dialogues. His final book is called The Reveries of the Solitary Walker, which is structured as a series of promenades. It suggests that for Rousseau, walking induces a sort of hypnosis, a trance-like state. It opens a void and takes him to another plane of being. Quote, "The mind loses its grip on reality and abandons itself to its own exuberance. Reverie unfolds inwardly while involving the will. The body, without involving the will. The body becomes absorbed in the rhythm of walking to such a degree that conscious reflection is curtailed or eliminated, allowing the images of the reverie to appear, as it were, spontaneously, gratuitously, effortlessly." So that he's the first one to identify what I'm talking about, which is that walking leads to a kind of reverie. And I'm arguing that reverie or associative thinking is crucial to poetry, and it's alogical, or what John Keats calls non-consecutive thinking. In one of his letters, he says, I can't understand how anything of importance was determined by consecutive reasoning. So non-consecutive reasoning is the movement, the way that poetry thinks, which is different than philosophy, essays, logical argument. So Rousseau is trying to distinguish a particular kind of thinking as a philosopher. And he's thinking of how his kind of philosophy, which is a kind of poetic philosophy, is going to distinguish itself from previous philosophy. And here he is in the seventh walk. I think this is funny. "Reverie relaxes and amuses me. Reflection tires and saddens me. Thinking always was a painful and charmless occupation for me. Sometimes my reveries end in meditation, but more often my meditations end in reverie. And during these wanderings, my soul rambles and glides through the universe on the wings of the imagination, in ecstasies which surpass every other enjoyment." This is the hallmark of romantic meditation. This kind of thinking is going to lead to Wordsworth and Coleridge and Keats and Byron and Shelley. It's going to lead to a kind of romantic poetics related to walking. So I've got two subjects in play now. One is the contingent experience of walking itself, and it's how it stimulates the imagination. And the other is the representation of walking in poetry, and how the Romantic poets reinvented the genre of the walking poem, which has its precursors in pastoral tradition. If you think of the Idylls of Theocritus or the Georgics of Virgil, the first pastoral poem, the poet goes out and walks amongst the shepherds, and he listens to them, and then he imitates their singing. The pastoral walk was meant to return, it's an urban poem, by an urban poet who goes out into the country, who finds himself relieved in a supposedly simpler realm, an easier realm, a more natural realm. So just let's linger for a moment over pilgrimages, from Dante's Commedia to Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, over Middle English poems like Pearl, Piers Plowman, The Legend of Good Women. It was a medieval convention that walking could lead to visionary dreaming. Here's a quote from Spenser. Calm was the day, and through the trembling air, sweet-breathing Zephyrus did softly play, a gentle spirit that lightly did delay, hot Titan's beams, which then did glister fair, when I, whom sullen care through discontent of my long fruitless stay in princes' courts and expectations vain of idle hopes, which still do fly away, like empty shadows did afflict my brain, walked forth to ease my pain along the shore of silver streaming Thames. So I just have for a moment, I'm presenting you with the collective idea of going on pilgrimages. Because the reason that's crucial in, say, the Canterbury Tales is everyone's going together. Now, what the Romantic poets do is they take that collective walk and they make it an internal process, something that happens alone. That longing folk to go on pilgrimages, the pilgrimage is the poet alone going out in nature. And both Wordsworth and Coleridge like to associate, like to walk, like to think about poetry. And there, I have here somewhere a quote by, I thought I had here, Hazlitt describing in his essay on going a journey how Coleridge and Wordsworth read their poems. There is a chant in the recitation of both Coleridge and Wordsworth which acts as a spell upon the hearer and disarms the judgment. Coleridge told me that he liked to compose over uneven ground or breaking through the strangling branches of a wood, whereas Wordsworth always wrote, if he could, walking up a straight gravel path or on some spot where the continuity of his verse met with no collateral interruption. And Hazlitt weirdly goes on to suggest that Coleridge's work is more uneven because of the way he walks, and it's more ragged and irregular in its rhythms, whereas Wordsworth chanted by walking up and down, going back and forth outside the yard. So I want to read you 3 passages now. You're not getting too tired out yet. Tell me when you are. I'm going to read you a few passages now because I want you to hear something. At the end, it's how poetry engages previous poetry. So Wordsworth is walking in the prelude and he's echoing Milton. So you remember at do you remember the end of Paradise Lost, where Milton, Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden? And I want you to hear these 4 lines because they're going to be echoed first by Wordsworth and then by Whitman. So Adam and Eve are walking out of the Garden of Eden into history. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They hand in hand with wandering steps and slow through Eden took their solitary way. So now, in the prelude, the phrase to remember is the world was all before them, where to choose. Spectacular moment in Paradise Lost. Now here's Wordsworth in the prelude. The earth is all before me, with a heart joyous, nor scared at its own liberty, I look about. And should the chosen guide be nothing better than a wandering cloud, I cannot miss my way. I breathe again. What Wordsworth does is reverses Milton. Whereas Milton starts in the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve go out into the world itself, they lose paradise Wordsworth leaves the city, echoes Milton, but reverses it and moves into the countryside, which he thinks of as a kind of paradise. So he reverses the motion. Whitman does the same thing. Alone and light-hearted, I take to the open road, healthy, free, the world before me, the long brown path before me, leading wherever I choose. So they're consciously echoing Milton, but they're reversing Milton and moving out into the world itself and arguing that the world itself is a kind of paradise. Now, for Whitman, it's America. For Wordsworth, it's rural England. Do I have a moment to say something about John Clare? Do you know about John Clare? John, you still with me here? Because I can cut off at any point and we can just ask questions. So I have other things to say, but I'll just say a word about John Clare. John Clare was called the peasant poet. He's a great English, lesser-known English pastoral poet. Now, the thing about Clare is he wasn't like Wordsworth. He wasn't a suburbanite who's moved into the country. He's a country boy. And the thing that's remarkable about Clare's poems, which are walks in the country, is that he lived during the period of enclosure in England. I don't know if you know how much about 19th century English history, but in the 19th century, England began to enact rules of what were called laws of enclosure. And these laws of enclosure were a way of segmenting private property. And they took public lands and they basically gave them to individual people who were wealthy or sold them. So the government took these lands and partitioned them and gave them off to individual people. So when Clare began walking in these places, he was walking on his own. When the acts of enclosure were enacted in the 1840s, Clare could no longer walk in the same places because they were now private property. And he describes these walks in remarkable rural poems. So I'm suggesting here now that a certain kind of rural poem can also have a kind of politics. Because these poems are poems of, by just describing the natural world, they take on a kind of political implication. And here's a poem that will describe what I'm talking about. It's called, so here's Clare in a very good mood. Well, down the green meadow and up the lone glen and down the woodside far away from all men, and there we'll talk over our love tales again, where last year the nightingale sung. By the way, there's a wonderful poem by John Clare called The Nightingale, in which he's extremely annoyed with the way poets have been describing nightingales because they haven't actually seen them. He thinks they're just metaphors. And he actually describes how a nightingale looks, and then he describes how it sounds. It's like, chee, 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 chee. I mean, he like transcribes the sounds of a nightingale for like 35 or 40 lines. But they're not words, they're just literally the sounds. He's trying to describe the sound. It's really a riot. So, but this is the poem that I wanted to bring to you. It's called Trespass. I dreaded walking where there was no path, and pressed with cautious tread the meadow swath, and always turned to look with wary eye, and always feared the owner coming by. Yet everything about where I'd gone appeared so beautiful I ventured on, and when I gained the road where all are free, I fancied every stranger frowned at me, and every kinder look appeared to say, you've been on trespass in your walk today. I've often thought, the day appeared so fine, how beautiful if such a place were mine, but having naught, I never feel alone, and cannot use another's as my own. So this walk is extremely alert to social and economic alienation, to the loss of communal lands. And it takes on, these unfettered walks take on what E.P. Thompson calls a nature of ecological protest. So these walks of Clare's in the countryside lead directly to poets who you may be more familiar with. Thomas Hardy, Edward Thomas, Seamus Heaney. When you read a walk poem by them, they're following in the tradition of Wordsworth and Clare. So American walking poems take off in two different directions. One through Thoreau into the countryside, and that leads directly to, say, Gary Snyder or A.R. Ammons or Wendell Berry, all poets of walking. Walt Whitman's Walks in the City, that leads directly to urban poets like Mira Rukeyser, Galway Canal, who we just lost, Philip Levine, Gerald Stern. They're walks in the city with this sort of urban pedestrianism. So it leads to sort of Manhattan Island, like that. Walking takes us into the world, but it also brings us home. We come back restored from nature or refreshed by the city. Sometimes we return depleted, sometimes elated. We meet others on our walks, but most of all, we keep bumping into ourselves. Conrad Aiken writes, "For in this walk, this voyage, it is yourself, the profound history of yourself, that now as always you encounter." I'm just going to read you one more poem. And then we can talk about poetry. Or whatever else you like to talk. I am so small, walking on the beach at night under the widening sky. The wet sand quickens beneath my feet, and the waves thunder against the shore. I am moving away from the boardwalk with its colorful streamers of people and the hotels with their blinking lights. The wind sighs for hundreds of miles. I am disappearing so far into the dark, I have vanished from sight. I am a tiny seashell that has secretly drifted ashore and carries the sound of the ocean surging through its body. I am so small now no one can see me. How can I be filled with such a vast love? So, thank you.
Those of you who would like to ask questions, please do. Annie will come around with a mic.
We don't need a mic.
Oh, we don't know. Needs a mic either way. And then there are books in the back and refreshments on that side after Edward or after he's finished talking.
We only let you go to the refreshments if you have a book.
Something like that. Questions?
Thoughts?
We're all the people.
I went to Penn, so that struck up a nerve.
Yeah.
It brought back my
When you
whole
in the
English
folklore
major
program,
thing.
yeah.
How did you become a poet? And this is wonderful. Thank you. This whole thing is wonderful.
I started writing poetry in high school out of emotional desperation. I really was overwhelmed by feelings that I didn't understand, and I just began to write them down. But really, that's the way almost all adolescents write poetry. And I saw when I wrote it, girls liked that. So that was good. But I wouldn't say I was writing poetry, but I was writing things in lines. When I went to college, I went to Grinnell College in Iowa, and I had a teacher, super cute, named Carol Parsman, in my freshman humanities class, and I brought her my poems. I told her I was writing poetry. And she essentially said to me, you could be a poet. You have the imagination, you have the intelligence, and you have the passion, but what you're writing are not poems. You're just transcribing your feelings. They read like diary entries. And the reason they're not poems is because you're not trying to make anything. You're just expressing yourself. But a poem is a form of making something. And if you want to make something, if you want to be a poet, then you need to read poetry, because I hadn't read much poetry. You need to read poetry, and you need to try and enter into the realm of poetry. So I started reading. She told me stuff. And by the way, for any students here, if every time someone mentions a poet, you go and read that poet, and you do that for 40 years, you do learn something. So I'd never heard of anything, but I vowed that when people would mention poets, I would go and read them. And I really liked reading, and it comforted me. And I can tell you the exact moment where something changed for me. I was a freshman. I'd never heard of a poet named Gerard Manley Hopkins, and someone mentioned him in class, and I went to the library and I got a Hopkins book, and I went back to my dorm room and I read a poem, one of the so-called terrible sonnets, and it begins, I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. What hours, oh, what black hours we have spent this night. What sights you, heart, saw, ways you went, and more must, and yet longer lights delay. With witness I speak this, for I say hours, I mean years, mean life, and my lament is cries countless, cries like dead letters sent to dearest him who lives, alas, away. I am gall, I am heartburn, and so forth. That just went completely through me. Hopkins was describing some loneliness that I had felt but could not name. And it didn't make me less lonely, it made me more comforted, even though it was such a desolate poem. Because the fact that someone else had done it, had described it. And I thought, I want to do that. I want to be like that. I want to write a poem like that. Then I started looking at it, I go, holy shit, this thing is a sonnet. You mean he didn't just write down out of his feelings? He didn't just, what?
And it's not a terrible sonnet.
It's not a terrible sonnet at all, exactly. It's an outstanding sonnet. So you go, well, so he structured this. Now later, this experience became for me a kind of metaphor for reading poetry itself. I mean, here's a Jesuit priest writing from a third remove. He's in Ireland, he's in the 1860s, and he writes this desolate sonnet. And here I am, a Jewish kid from Chicago, and I'm in my dorm room in 1968, and this poem speaks more directly to me than anything anyone else has said around me. And that poetry had communicated it this way. It seemed really generous to me. That he had described the experience, he had dramatized his experience. And I started to say I wanted to do that, I wanted to be like that. And from that moment, I believe I started to become a poet, because I tried to make something. I wasn't a good poet, but I wasn't just describing my feelings. I was trying to shape them into something. I was trying to make something. The oldest word for poetry in Greek is poiesis, which means making. Poet is a maker and a poem is a made thing. And from the moment that I stopped trying to just describe my feelings and tried to enact them and to use them to make something, I was on my path. And I became addicted to that. I mean, I felt consoled by trying to transform the muck and mire of my own life into something else. And so I became interested in poetry itself. And over time, I became less interested in my own feelings and more interested in poetry. But that took a long time. Thank you. I'm a teacher. You ask me a short question, I give you a long answer.
You mentioned that the poetry may not have a meaning, but did you also say there's a poetic philosophy? And we know of poets who have inspired and, either nationalistic feelings or some other type of feelings have moved people, nations.
Yes.
So, poetry has that power, but you said that it can be, I don't know, maybe it's all-encompassing.
I think that, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking me, but I think that there is public poetry, and there's nationalistic poetry, there's military poetry, poets write poems for armies to march. Yeats wrote some horrible ones for the black shirts. Not all poets are, radical leftists. But I think that there's a distinction between public poetry and what I think of as true poetry. And what I mean by this is there are poets who write political poems and who move whole nations, but they do it by writing from their own experience, from their own point of view. If you notice that a tremendous number of people have been paying attention to a poem by Langston Hughes, after what happened in Missouri, people have been downloading this poem, Let America Be America, from Langston Hughes tens of thousands of times. The thing about that poem is what Hughes says is, America is not America to me. He does not say, America is not America to us, but people read it as us. But I think this is important because if you think of what the poet has to offer to move people, it seems to me the personal opinion, the personal expression, the personal take on the communal situation, the social situation, is what's crucial in poetry. I'm trying to think of what does poetry do better than, say, political writing, because there's a lot of political writing. So what does it do? I think it gives you an emotional embodiment of an individual entering into the situation. And that's how Tagore can write a poem that becomes a national anthem. He ends up speaking for a whole people. But he didn't set out to speak for the whole people. He set out to speak for himself and include those people. And I think that's something that poetry does, if that answers your question.
Back to your idea about walking and actually the structure of poetry, have you made any connections between, in terms of meter, like the word foot and feet to describe poetry? And I'd love to hear your ideas on that.
No one knows exactly why people took feet as a metaphor, but it does seem to have something to do with the heartbeat and the pace of walking. What I would say is that poetry is a bodily art. It comes out of the body. It's not an entirely cerebral or intellectual art. It does pass through the mind, but it does because rhythm is part of the body. And so I think that as soon as you start thinking of rhythm being natural to poetry, then I think walking and the rhythm of walking starts to come into play. But I would distinguish walking from, say, dancing, which is a self-conscious art form in its own right. Now, Paul Valéry distinguished prose from poetry by saying that prose is walking, poetry is dancing. But what he meant by that is that prose gets from one place to the next, whereas dancing is a self-conscious art. So I'm saying my pace provokes my thoughts. So there is something about poetry which is both inside the body but not entirely inside the body. Meter seems to be grounded in rhythm. Meter is a way of formulating rhythm. It's a way of describing rhythm. And breaking it up into the foot may have something to do with walking. But the term comes from Greek and from Greek rhythm. And this messes us up a little because Greek rhythm is the terms, iambic, pentameter, iambic, dactylic, all those are imported from Greek. And Greek is quantitative, whereas English is qualitative. So they don't exactly work accurately because English is a stress language. I'm sorry if it's getting too technical. English has stresses and unstressed words because of its combination of Anglo-Saxon and Latinate roots. But Greek is totally quantitative, and Greeks broke up their division, their lines, by the length of sounds, by long syllables and short syllables. No one knows exactly how it sounds, but some people have tried to make approximations. You can go on the internet and hear someone trying to read Sappho as they think it sounded. It's extremely strange because it's uninflected, but it goes for longer and shorter, and some people think that was related to choruses in Greek plays, and that was related to dancing. So that the foot was related to physical movement, but not walking, but so much as dancing. And that was a way of describing the movement of the chorus and the rhythm of the lines. And the example of that would be Pindar, if that helps at all.
It seems we're talking about two different ways of how walking and poetry are connected. And I think what you were talking about was how the kind of use of mind that a poet has is lubricated or stimulated by walking. And that there's different kinds of walking. And there's urban walking, which 100,000 things are coming into your head and you're responding to them in a very individualistic, spontaneous way, without judgment, without relation, without conclusions. And that walking in nature, like the cloud will be my guide, or I'm stepping and making into a world of choice, that's different, but both of them are using the walk as a way of opening self.
That's right.
Opening up self.
That's right.
The walking in relation to rhythm or meter or that's a completely different story. And that has to do with dance, and it has to do with chorus, and it has to do with theater. But it doesn't have to do with mind in the
Right.
same sense.
Right.
But
That's right.
they're not unconnected.
Right.
Because we are a body.
That's right.
But there are different ways of using that to talk about the walk.
Nicely put.
Thank you.
Want to come around the country with me? I'll
Yes.
call on you when.
Sometimes you walk and sometimes you talk and
Yeah,
sometimes
yeah,
I'll
yeah,
walk.
yeah. I should stop making that joke because I made that joke recently and it was just like so crazy because it was in California and I was giving a reading and every time I read there was a woman in the front who just kept going, oh, oh. So she asked a question later and said about Charles Bukowski and I said, well, it's not, I just don't think my work has much in common with Charles Bukowski. And she said, that's not true. It has a lot in common with Charles Bukowski. But when I was reading, every time she was so responsive to my reading that I said, do you want to come around the country with me? Then when she said, do you think your work is like Charles Bukowski's? I said, no. She goes, that's not true. I was married to Charles Bukowski. I go, I just asked Charles Bukowski's widow to come around the country. Exactly. Typical.
In some languages, the word for poem and the word for song are the same, Hebrew for one. Could you talk about the distinctions and the commonalities between poetry and song?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I go into great detail about this in a poet's glossary because the glossary is, an international glossary, and so in different cultures the word for poetry and the word for song are the same, but in other cultures it differs. And in English it used to be the same and then it differed, and then it parts. So let's just say that in some cultures there's no distinction. It's the same in some tribal cultures, especially where there's no writing or most of the population is oral. So poetry and song are the same. If you think about, say, in English, a poet like Campion, then poetry and music are basically, essentially the same. But there is a place when starting with writing where in some cultures poetry and song start to move in different directions. So that when Pablo Neruda says, I am a singer, we understand that that's actually a metaphor. He's not really a singer. He's not singing his songs the way people are singing ghazals in Afghanistan. He's a writer. And that writing opens a different kind of space. So we're really talking about the difference now between oral poetry and written poetry. Poetry that's entirely oral is often indistinguishable from song in many cultures. And it goes above speech. There were bards who recite epics who were called singers, even though they're sometimes singing and sometimes chanting. But when poetry is written, it opens up a different space than song. So when you are listening, when people were in an audience and they were listening to Homer, the Iliad was not meant to be read, it was meant to be heard, and it's washing over you. Now, when you hear a great Homeric simile that goes on for 25 lines, you're listening to it, you cannot pause, stop, and rewind it. You have to just go on, or else you're going to totally lose the story. I don't know if this ever happened to you at a poetry reading where someone says a line and you like that line, you start thinking about it, you forget about the whole poem because you can't stop. But when Sappho writes Eros the bittersweet, and she takes the word bitter and she takes the word sweet and puts it together for the first time, we have a new feeling that love is not just bitter and is not just sweet, but it's something else which we all recognize now as an accurate truth about something, sweet bitter or bitter sweet. That's a space for writing where you can brood and meditate about that. And the thing about poetry as written is it gives you the space to think, to reread, to stop, which song does not do. So in some cultures, they don't have that experience. It's only meant to be sung. Or you take, say, the child ballads in England, which you can read them now, but they were clearly, what we're reading is a transcription. They were really meant to be sung. But there are other poems then, starting in the Renaissance in English literature, where the poems are really meant to be read, sometimes aloud, or read to yourself, but not sung. For example, Shakespeare's sonnets. Those are not poems that are meant to be sung. They're meant to be read aloud or to yourself, but they don't operate the same as the songs in the plays, for example, which are really meant not to be read, but to be heard. So that's a kind of distinction between singing and writing, between the oral poet and the written poet, if that makes sense to you. So I think it's a question of how it operates on you in different cultures. And in many cultures, there's no distinction. It's just the same thing. And that's even after there's writing. But in other cultures, and I think ours is one of them, there starts to be a difference between what a song is and what a poem is. Not that there isn't tremendous overlap, but they are somewhat different. They are somewhat different things. Is that?
I think.
Really? We're kind of getting into it.
We could go a little
Yes, no,
longer,
it's
but
okay.
I want
It's
people
good.
to have a chance to have some refreshments and also to meet you and maybe pick up some of your books and hear you sing on the page.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.